Okay, good morning, everyone. The time is now 10 o'clock and the inquiry is reopened. This is day 6 for sitting for the inquiry. We have just had the fire alarm test, so if it happens again, it's not a test. So, for the benefit of anyone who has not been at the inquiry before, my name is Helen Heward and I'm the Planning Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this inquiry into an appeal made by Clearstone Energy Limited under Section 78 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 against the decision of East Devon District Council to refuse planning permission for a proposed development described as the construction, operation and maintenance of a battery energy storage system with associated infrastructure and works, including highway access, landscaping and biodiversity enhancements at land just south of Hazelhurst, Raymond's Hill, Axminster, Devon. So just a reminder, if you could make sure all devices are set to silent, please, for the duration of the inquiry. Again, we'll aim to break for lunch around 1 o'clock and take suitable breaks in the morning and the afternoon, all dependent on what suits the needs of the inquiry most. So today we are going to start with the appellant's evidence for contamination. Before we move to Mr. Fellows, we've just got a number of housekeeping matters that if we could attend to. So yesterday afternoon I was told that conditions were circulating. Is there any update overnight?
As I understand it, Madam, the conditions are agreed as between the appellant and the local planning authority. They've been sent over to the Rule 6 party for comment.
Sorry, Mr. Parkins.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, that's right. I think we got them yesterday evening about 9 o'clock and we started looking through them, but obviously we haven't completed doing that. But what we will do is make sure that by the time we discuss conditions tomorrow, we've fully digested. And given Mr. Jones giving evidence today, I suspect what will probably happen is this evening I'll sit down with him and go through them. So if there are any obvious changes, we can send them across to the appellants this evening so that they've got advance notice. But either way, we'll be in a position to discuss them on Thursday.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that. Just as a heads up, what's in the back of my mind, there were quite a lot of points arising from conditions and maybe they will take a bit of talking through. So I have got it as a backstop in my head that it's possible that conditions could go to a virtual session before we move to closings, because I am aware that we're running out of time and in this particular case I certainly don't think it's one where we can rush conditions. Miss Osmond-Smith.
Yeah, Madam, I was wondering if it would be helpful for you to see a copy of where the appellant and the council have got to. I appreciate that your timetable is compressed as well. There's a lot to get through in the inquiry day, but if that would be useful, we can have a printed copy for you today.
That would be helpful, thank you. Yes, we've all got the same time constraints, haven't we? Mr. Parkinson.
Madam, on that suggestion of potentially not doing conditions tomorrow, but doing it at a later point, I think on our side we would support that. It would give us more time to consider and also give our comments to the appellant, so it might narrow down, I don't know what's in dispute, but it might narrow down some issues in dispute. But also Mr. Jones can't be here tomorrow afternoon and I was going to speak on his behalf. It would give the opportunity for Mr. Jones to speak himself, which I'm sure will be more useful to you than hearing from me.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mr. Parkinson. I've noticed Miss Osmond-Smith doesn't seem to be disagreeing with it going to an online session. So shall we say that now to avoid further discussion, etc.? Are we all happy for that? Yeah, okay. So conditions move to an online session, but I'm going to have today a copy of the version that's agreed between the council and the appellant, and tomorrow I'm going to have any update that we've got on that before we adjourn. So thank you. I think I've just had those handed in to me, quite a weighty document. So that will need adding to the inquiry documents now. Shall we put that as a separate document, please?
ID 17. Yeah.
Just a point of clarification. Yesterday, when we were going through the inquiry documents, we touched on an issue that had been raised by an interested party when they addressed the inquiry relating to a species that it's necessary to keep confidential the details of. We don't actually, therefore, have an inquiry document to record, but I am satisfied that the council, the appellant and the Rule 6 party have all jointly looked at this matter for me and have all confirmed that there isn't anything that's been overlooked that I needed to have brought to my attention for this inquiry. Okay, I think we've also had emailed into the office the site visit, the updated site visit plan to provide an accurate record of where I did go.
I haven't seen that.
Okay, can we make sure we get copies of that to Mr. Digby, and then that will be, do we have a reference for that already, or will that be ID 18?
We don't have a reference, so that will be ID 18.
Okay, we were then going to discuss when we could actually hold the virtual day for the inquiry. I have brought along my diary, she said. Have you discussed amongst yourselves a date that would suit at all yet?
No, I think we were waiting for your availability, madam, probably being the most important starting point for all of us.
Okay, thank you. I have to admit I have a lot of constraints next week. I'm imagining most people around the table similarly have a lot of constraints next week. Right, so the following week we are into April, so I have availability on the 1st or the 2nd. Similarly, I could make availability on the 7th or the 8th. Shall I leave those dates with you for you to come back to me later today to see if you can find a time that works for everyone?
Madam, yes, except just to say I I'm not available on any of those dates because I'm at an inquiry for those 2 weeks. So I mean that inquiry finishes that week that starts on the 7th. I think on the Thursday or the Friday. But the 7th and the 8th I wouldn't be able to do, I'm afraid.
Okay, so did you say you could do the end of that week?
Yes, but it's one of those where the sort of reserve days. So, I mean, I think yes, but not with any certainty, which is then would mean pushing it back quite a bit further. I mean, the other option is it would mean pushing it back further unless somebody else could stand in for me to do conditions and closing.
I appreciate that's not ideal for you.
I should make clear as well, Madam, that if we're into April, then Mr. Byers will be delivering the closing submissions. But of course, he's been here for the whole thing, so I have no doubt he'll manage that just fine.
My difficulty is if we don't get it in by the 10th, I'm then to the week of the 21st.
I think. Can I perhaps come back later in the day? I think the 10th will work because had the other inquiry that we, by the time we will be on the final day at the very least at the other inquiry, and I think my me being there to read out the closing will be less essential there.
Okay, thanks,
So I
Mr.
think the 10th
Parkinson.
could work.
I can see you're thinking hard how to try and assist the inquiry. So I'll leave that with you to come back to me later in the day, and perhaps after you've had a chat with other parties. But provisionally, then we're looking towards the 10th of April. Right. Were there any other matters that we need to deal with now before we go to Mr. Fellows? I do remember that I asked for the parties to put together a note for me about what the fire service had had and where we were, but we can deal with that later on, shall we? Okay. All right. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Fellows. Right. I'll hand over now to Miss Osmond-Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam, and I'm going to introduce Mr. Fellows from his proof of evidence on page 3, and then we'll deal with documents when I've introduced him to the inquiry. So good morning to you, Mr. Fellows. You set out at section 1 your personal background, where you tell us you are Andrew Fellows, you're an Associate Technical Director at RSK Geosciences, a trading name of RSK Environment Limited, a large environmental consultancy with offices located across the UK. At 1.2 is your qualifications and experience, where you tell us that you have a degree in physical geography from Portsmouth University. You're a member of the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management, the Society of Brownfield Risk Assessment, and you're on the Specialist Inland Condition Register. You have worked in the field of site investigation and land contamination risk assessment for over 18 years, and you specialise in the quantitative risk assessment of land contamination, including achieving accreditation with the Society for Human Health, Controlled Waters, Permanent Gas and Vapour Intrusion Risk Assessment. You currently act as a scrutineer for the SOBRA accreditation scheme. You were accepted onto the Specialist in Land Condition Register and as a suitably qualified person in June 2022. That's all true and correct.
That's correct.
at 1.3, you give this declaration that the evidence that you present to this appeal on behalf of Clearstone Energy Limited is true and has been prepared in accordance with the code of conduct of your professional chartered institution, irrespective of by who you are instructed. You confirm that the opinions expressed are your true and professional opinions. Is that all still true and correct?
That's correct.
Very much. I think you should have the oath on the table in front of you. If I can ask you, please, Mr. Fellows, to read that out.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fellows. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to give a list of documents that people might well need to refer to during the course of your evidence. And we have your proof, rebuttal, and technical note errata, which is ID 14. We have the proofs of evidence of Mr. Carpenter and Mr. Laxon. We have potentially as well the need to refer to Mr. Blunden and Mr. Rigby's evidence. Then on top of that, we have CD 1.26, which is the Controlled Waters Environment Risk Assessment from May 2024. The Site Safety Report is at Core Document 136. The overarching Statement of Common Ground with the Council is CD 4.7.1. We've got the LCRM Guidance, which is Core Document 515. We've got the Syria Guidance at Core Document 12.9. Madam, I've got a printed copy of that because I couldn't find it in my document. So if you need one of those, it's there. Then we've got the Devon and Somerset Fire and Rescue Comments, which Core Document 18.2, which is the February 2024 comments. And ID 19.1, better known as the Local Planning Authority's opening statement. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Fellows, I'm going to start by asking you, please, drawing all of the evidence that you provided for the inquiry together in reviewing the documents, to just outline what the framework is for land contamination and risk assessment for projects like this.
So we have quite a clear and robust framework for how we assess land contamination in the UK. And that is Environment Agency Guidance, which we call LCRM, Land Contamination Risk Management. That guidance sets out our approach, which is a staged assessment of risk. That stage assessment always starts with a desktop study. So we're looking at the condition of the site, informed by a site visit or site walkover. And we do a qualitative assessment of risk from contamination. Though that qualitative assessment, that identification of the issues, then helps us inform further stages, which are, second stage is site investigation. The next stage is a more quantitative risk assessment, followed by, and if it's required, remediation and remediation verification activity. Now, the framework is also updated more recently to include new pollution. So the framework was originally set up to look at historic contamination. So that is sites that have a past industrial use and have a level of contamination that can be quantified and assessed. But with new pollution, there's a slightly different scope to the guidance, which is now captured within LCRM.
Mr. Fellows, do you think you could move the speaker a little bit closer to you, because I'm struggling to...
Apologies.
Thank you.
Would you like me to repeat anything?
Thank you very much. Now, we've been dealing, of course, with source pathway receptor linkages, and that's how you've looked at this? What's the source? What's the risk from that source? And then how that might get to the receptors as a result of a fire incident. And to help us understand that, you've produced a conceptual site model, and we've got that in your proof of evidence at page 11, following after 3.5. And it's plate 4 conceptual site model. If we can turn that up. Why have you produced this, and what does it show?
So one of the key tasks in that initial desk-based assessment is to set out our understanding of the site environment, our understanding of the potential sources of contamination that might be present or could be present, and our understanding of receptors and the pathways that could link these sources to the receptors and therefore result in a potential risk. The diagrammatic conceptual site model is one way of representing those relationships between the source, the pathways, and the receptors. And it's a very useful way of communicating to clients, regulators, all audiences, what those issues are. So what we can see in plate 4 is an expanded diagram of the site in its proposed condition. The conceptual site model is always developed for a development site in its proposed state, taking into account all of the features that are proposed as part of that development, such as the drainage system and relevant structures, and how people would use that site. We show the site geology. So from a review of the geological mapping, the site topography, we can infer that the claywood flints is likely to be in the region of about 20-24 metres thickness. Beneath that, we've got the upper greensand formation, which is our principal aquifer and contains groundwater. And we estimate that as approximately 14 metres thickness. And beneath the upper greensand formation, we have the Charmouth mudstone formation, which is an impermeable stratum and confines that groundwater. So the other points to note with respect to the site condition is, and the relevant source pathway receptor linkages, is that we also identify potential off-site receptors. So within this drawing, we show that there's off-site residents with arrows indicating that. We show potential groundwater migration pathways and the potential to interlink with water resources, surface waters, and so on. One thing that's quite useful, if we turn to figure 2 of the Mr. Carpenter's proof of evidence.
Fellows. Mr. Fellows is softly spoken. That much is obvious. I think unless he holds it up to his mouth, then it's not going to get a great deal louder. But there are seats right behind him, which will perhaps assist in being able to hear him a little better for those that are struggling.
Apologies, I also have a cold.
That's all right, Mr. Fellows. Your voice is your voice. We just need to accommodate everybody.
I'll move this closer.
You could come closer. There's a table there if you'd like to sit there. I'll just check the gentleman at the back. Are you okay? Can you hear? Okay, could we take that point again then, please?
Yes, we're talking, Mr. Fellows, about the Plate 4 conceptual site model that you've got within your proof of evidence on page 11. And I was asking you what that shows and really how it's been put together and why. And I think also as well, just to pick up at this stage, that follows on from the site environmental context that you've outlined in the pages beforehand, where you've also set out the superficial geology and also the bedrock geology as taken from various data sources, primarily the British Geological Survey. So again, if you can just go over that and explain for the benefit of everyone what that's doing and what it tells us.
Of course. So the conceptual site model provides a readily accessible interpretation of the current site condition with respect to the site geology, as we know from geological maps, the proposed development, as we know from the proposed development plans, and how that could interact with the underlying strata, the groundwater, and potential pathways for contamination that require further assessment, and the potential circumstances in which a source of contamination could be present, which includes the potential for a fire incident. I noted in my previous summary that based on the geological records and based on the site topography, we infer that the thickness of the clay with flints would be circa 20 metres, and the upper greensand formation, which is the principal aquifer, would be around 14 metres thickness, and that's underlain by an impermeable stratum of the Charmouth mudstone formation. Now, our conceptual model is very much is drawn very much to show the site boundaries and to show the site in its particular context. I would like to refer you to the other conceptual model developed by Mr. Carpenter, which is in his figure 2 in his proof of evidence.
So that's at the back?
That's at the, yes.
Okay.
It isn't actually labelled figure two in my document, but you're happy I'm looking at what you want me to look at.
Yes. And the point I'd like to make is that clearly this is two independent reviews of the same information in terms of the site's geological and hydrogeological context. The drawing provided by Mr. Carpenter has a 5 times vertical exaggeration, which means that the scale of the verticality of the site is enlarged, which shows the site in its context in terms of a much steeper hill than is the case in reality. But the key issue is that the same pathways have generally been identified in both conceptual models. The clay with flints is indicated in their conceptual model as of a similar thickness, as with the potential greensand aquifer is shown with groundwater at the same inferred depth of about 30 metres below ground level at the site.
Thank you. Anything else to say on that? That drawing from Mr. Carpenter, or we'll come back to pathways anyway, through to the aquifer in due course. But can I understand from you, please, what work is being carried out by the appellant to assess the risk on this site from proposed battery energy storage development? And was that work done appropriate?
Yes, so I'd refer you to the controlled waters risk assessment that was prepared by RMA Environmental on behalf of the appellant. This is CD 1.26. Now, This assessment also provided a desk-based assessment of potential for contamination at the site, including the potential for contamination arising from a fire scenario. And the report took into account the environmental sensitivity of the area and identified that water resources were of a high sensitivity due to the potential for private water supplies. The report also identified potential surface water flow pathways via the whole Batch Brook, which is to the south of the site, and that as a potential conduit for firewater runoff in the event of an uncontrolled release. And it also took into account the site development proposals, including the drainage system and the water containment strategy. Now, RMA utilised a qualitative risk assessment. They identified those particular sources, pathways and the receptors, and they used a qualitative risk assessment, which is typically used for infrastructure projects. And they were very clear in their report on the methodology they used. They were clear on the terminology that they adopted in utilising that methodology. And they looked at the site with respect to potential baseline scenarios without mitigation, so that's without the drainage system, without the development mitigation afforded by what was proposed. And obviously they identified that without those measures, then there was a potential major adverse effect on water resources. However, as part of this process, they then take into consideration what the magnitude of effect is on water resources with mitigation. So what is the consequence, potentially, with these systems in place as per the proposed development design. And they concluded that because there was a drainage system, because there was an impermeable liner proposed under the site, that would effectively break the contaminant pathway to affect water resources, and identified that therefore the significant effects to water resources would be negligible. And what negligible means is not how we might think of negligible. It means that there will be no significant change to baseline conditions. In that sense, with those issues in place, with those development proposals in place, there would not be an impact to water resources. Now, in my opinion, I think that the document as submitted provides a reasonable and robust conclusion based on a clear methodology and a clear rationale.
And now that you've looked into matters and you've carried out your own work, are those the same conclusions that you come to in respect of the potential impact arising from this development?
In short, yes.
Miss Osman-Smith, could you get Mr. Fellows to walk me through the document to some of those key points, please? It's quite a large document.
Core document 1.26? Yes, of course. Yes, Mr. Fellows, you've heard the inspector, that's the Controlled Waters Environmental Risk Assessment. You've spoken about that in broad terms. Are there specific points within this to pick up on? And are you able to just give the inspector a read through that document?
Yeah, of course. Let me just bring that up. Okay, so just to take you through that document in a general sense, the document details the proposed development on page 3. They place the assessment that they've done in an appropriate legislative and planning policy context. They then discuss their methodology. So they discuss how they would assess the baseline condition of the site, and then how they would assess and evaluate the effects to that baseline condition. And that's on pages 6. So there's lots of definitions provided within that methodology. So they have recognised the site sensitivity details, such as the site being over a principal aquifer. They've recognised that there could be abstractions in close proximity to the site, and they've recognised that when they look at the magnitude of effect, they define what they mean by that in Table 2.2. So when they come to their conclusions, you can look back at how they got to those conclusions in a very clear, systemic way. And I think, just to clarify, in terms of my review of the document, they clearly set out the site hydrological condition. They specifically provide a chapter on potential impacts from a fire scenario. And that is
That is at page 17 from 5.27.
and they look at the site during its construction and operation as well, which is a holistic approach, in order that they identify issues that otherwise would be dealt with during construction, such as surface water runoff and silt issues and so on. But specific to the pollutant contaminant issues of concern, as raised by the Rule 6 party, they provide a clear, rational assessment of the risk from a fire incident to the water environment. They identify the sensitivity of that environment. They identify the mitigation on page 19. That is supplied by the drainage design. And then they come to a logical conclusion on table 5.1 on what those residual effects would be with those mitigations in place.
Does that assist, Madam?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, then, we're going to move on, Mr. Fellows, to source. And I want to understand what the potential sources are of contaminants in respect of this scheme, both in terms of normal operation and also in the event of a fire.
So, in normal operation of this site, the site is in an agricultural field. It's not in an area of that we would consider to be historically contaminated. And therefore, in normal operation and the site as developed would not pose a source of contamination to the environment. So that leaves us with the only potential source of contamination being a potential fire incident and the resulting contaminants that could arise from that incident. We've already heard in evidence from Mr. Blunden, and I think it's an important point, that the probability of a fire incident is very low. Secondly, we've heard from Mr. Reynolds, who confirmed that from empirical studies, from previous BESS fire incidents that have occurred, that there were negligible levels of contaminants in groundwater. And there's been some measurement, for example, at Carnegie Road, of pH, which can give an indication of impacts from hydrofluoric acid. But also, he reported his view of testing that had been undertaken at Tilbury. We appreciate the confidentiality concerns around his access to that information, but he did state in his evidence and under oath that the concentrations were not above drinking water standards or environmental standards. So the potential for a contaminant source resulting from a fire, as indicated from empirical evidence, is uncertain. There are contaminants suggested by Mr. Carpenter in his proof on page 10, that potentially lithium, aluminium, and PFAS could be identified. And as I stated in my rebuttal, lithium and aluminium are not hazardous substances. There could be some PFAS, which are hazardous substances, and we've had a lot of discussion about that over the last few days. But their source concentration is inevitable uncertainty in what that source concentration would be in event of a fire, and with consideration to the various impacts from that fire in terms of temperature, in terms of thermal degradation of PFAS compounds, and how that source might affect the site.
So can we just deal a little bit more then with PFAS as a source, please, and how you've informed yourself of that as a potential source of contaminant?
So one study that has been identified in Environment Agency documentation with respect to contaminants from BESS did identify PFAS in water that was used to extinguish a battery, a vehicle battery flame. And that is the Quant et al. Paper that we give as CD 12.18. Mr. Reynolds already spoke to the suitability of that paper as a reference.
Sorry, what was the CD reference?
At 12.18. In both of our evidence, we reviewed that paper. We identified that the particular test that was undertaken was not from a BESS fire. These were electric vehicle batteries. And also the testing of the water was directly from the extinguishing of that fire, and therefore was not the same operation boundary cooling water scenario that we're dealing with at this particular site. We also note that it has been acknowledged by Mr. Laxon and Mr. Lester that there would be some combustion of PFAS during a fire due to the high temperatures involved. And therefore, there is uncertainty in the potential emission concentration that could occur. But their evidence in terms of the potential release of PFAS in soot based on different studies identified that these concentrations would be particularly low. And we heard yesterday, they agreed that yes, there would be, in terms of mass, in the milligram range, and therefore very small. Mr. Reynolds also indicated from the literature that he had reviewed that PFAS sources in a BESS fire would be lower than is indicated in those literature studies.
So anything else you want to say on source, or should we move to receptors?
I think we can move to receptors.
So on that then, who or what are the receptors that we need to think about in the event of a battery fire?
So these receptors are helpfully informed by a study that's already been undertaken by RMA. And we have first the human receptors. So these are residents living in proximity to the site. So we've got the nearest house, which is Hillcrest, at around 225 metres distant from the site. We also need to think about the nearest house in context of surface waters and potential surface water flow from the site. The nearest one is over 300 metres to the southeast. And I need to reference to the CD 4.71, which is the agreed statement of common ground with the local planning authority that that they agree there are properties in the area that are subject to private water obstructions to use private water supplies. However, it's not confirmed from their records that the properties in close proximity to the site do utilise private water supplies. The next receptor of concern is clearly groundwater. So we've already mentioned that the site is over a principal aquifer, the Upper Greensand Formation. A principal aquifer is a rock that readily facilitates transport of water and can be used for abstraction, has sufficient water within it to allow for abstraction, hence the private supplies are viable. And
Sorry, could you repeat that point for me?
yeah, of course. So a principal aquifer is defined as a water-bearing rock that contains, has sufficient permeability and sufficient characteristics to supply water for abstraction. So therefore, there is potential across that aquifer unit for private abstractions to take place. That groundwater is approximately 30 metres below ground level, based on the records that we have available to us. And we consider it as the primary controlled waters receptor, owing to its sensitivity as a potential potable resource. The site sits atop the boundary of two catchments. So we've got the Lower Axe catchment to the north, and we've got the Monkton Weald catchment, stream catchment to the southeast. Yeah.
Turn your microphone off. Thank you. You've set this out at plate 3 of your rebuttal. I think that the two catchments, so it might just be useful if we can just turn that up and understand the point that you're making here and what that means. Plate 3, page 7 of your rebuttal.
So what we're showing on plate 3 of my rebuttal is the catchment boundaries as mapped by DEFRA. And these indicate that the site is bisected by these catchments. And therefore, you would expect that rainwater falling onto the site would flow based on the topography of the site into one catchment or the other, depending on the location in which it falls. But we also need to consider the site in its developed state. So with regard to surface water receptors, and as set out in the RMA flood risk assessment, the sites will drain into Holbatch Brook, which is to the southeast, and within the catchment of the Monkton Weald stream, and is a tributary to that stream. There are springs recorded radially around the site, obviously topographically downhill from the site. And that's in positions where the upper greensand aquifer and the Charmouth mudstone are exposed.
To explain there, because it'll be relevant when we come to think about the pathways to how water might travel from the surface down into the aquifer. What does it mean, the greensand strata's exposed? And I'm looking at your 3.4.8 in your proof of evidence, plate 3. And also plate 1, I think are those useful places to go to understand this point?
They are. So it's helpful to understand the site geology as mapped. So the site is over this clay with flint strata, which is a superficial deposit sitting on top of the hill. And as we move away from the site and go down topographic level, you then reach the edges of that superficial deposit and you come across the bedrock deposit, which is the upper greensand formation at the surface. And this is where you could have infiltration to the catchment and to the upper greensand formation, where it's exposed, where it's at surface, and where it's subject to direct infiltration, percolation of rainwater, for instance. I think with reference to surface waters, we've heard evidence that surface water springs can be used for supply to private residences, and the evidence provided by Mr. Carpenter provides a series of locations where I've identified potential springs.
That up, if we can, please. That's the first plan that's included within his appendices, I think. And you also included a version of it within your rebuttal evidence. Is this the plan that you're talking about?
Yeah, so if we start with the first figure in the proof of evidence from Mr. Carpenter.
Which CD are we at? To assist me, Ms. Osman Smith has just torn out her page. There's no markings on it.
Mr. Fellows, carry on.
I don't know if my mic's working. Thank you. So just in terms of that particular drawing, I'd like to make the following observations. What you can see here is a very much a catchment scale drawing of the site. So it's very much zoomed out from the site itself. You can see that there's been an effort to identify and map potential springs and potential locations where private water supplies have been confirmed. And you can see, if you look over to the locations of those are all where the exposure of the upper greensand formation is shown. So that's the light green colouring on that drawing. The brown colouring is the superficial clay with flints deposit. And it's important to note that the majority of springs that are shown on that drawing are in yellow, and those are indicated as springs of use unknown in the legend. There are also green springs or green triangles, I should say, which are confirmed as being used for water supply purposes. The drawing also has an icon in the legend for private water supplies from boreholes, which are confirmed by residents. As an observation, I can't see any of those particular locations on this drawing. But one of the reasons that I have taken a more zoomed in look at that drawing in my rebuttal and that is specifically plate 5. There's two points to note here. Firstly, I've taken this particular layout, not from the drawing I've just referenced from Mr. Carpenter, because that has cross-section lines on it that don't clearly show the hydrology of the site. Instead, I've taken this from the statement of case drawing. But notwithstanding, you can see that the triangles are shown, and these are the locations of potential private water supply of greatest concern to us because they are in close proximity to the site. Now you can see I mentioned with regard to surface water receptors that the site would drain through Holbatch Brook, and on plate 5 you can see that that is shown with the big black arrow, and Holbatch Brook is a main stream that flows down that hill towards the wider surface water network. But one thing to note is that the private water supplies that are confirmed to be present are located on tributaries of that main channel. So, in my view, are not in direct connectivity to Holbatch Brook. They feed into Holbatch Brook. I think that's important, we can come on to later.
So we'll come on to that with pathways, Mr. Fellows. Yeah, okay. And just to flag as well, we'll talk a little bit more about the permeability of the clay with flints when we get there, and the difference between your position and Mr. Carpenter's. But the final receptor I want to discuss, please, is ecology. And what do we know about ecological receptors for this site?
So ecological receptors were again referenced and looked at by RMA in their submission. And we identify that the site is about 2.1 kilometres west of a triple SI. In terms of the hydraulic connectivity of the site to sensitive ecological receptors, the only ones that have been identified by RMA are the River Axe Special Area of Conservation and a triple SI located 4 kilometres to the northwest of the site. I should make another point that when we consider groundwater and surface water as a receptor, we often utilise standards that are also protective of the ecological systems that depend on those water supplies. So therefore, ecology is not necessarily a receptor of primary importance to that assessment, because there's some level of inherent protection in how we assess risk to surface water and groundwater.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to pathways then, while we've got all of our drawings out of the local hydrological situation to help us understand how water is moving around in this area. And the first pathway I'd like to explore with you, please, Mr. Fellows, is leaching. So that is water getting through the ground into the aquifer below. And there's a big difference between you and Mr. Carpenter here, because he says that water moves through the clay and into the aquifer. He's included water balancing equations within his evidence, and you've responded to that in your rebuttal. So talk to us then, please, about the potential for water to get from this site, from the ground, into the aquifer below via leaching.
So I think the first thing to note is a reference back to that conceptual model and back to that, interpretation of the site geology. The clay with flint strata is likely to be relatively thick, again at circa 20 metres thickness. Now, in Mr. Carpenter's evidence, on paragraphs 24 and 25, he made some points about the results of the site testing that was undertaken to inform the drainage design, which is contained in the RMA flood risk assessment. And he made a point that there could be, in some parts of the trial, in some trial pits that were undertaken at the site and were within the clay with flint strata, he made a point that some contained a small amount of water that was ingressing into those pits at slow rates, and some contained no water at all. And he inferred that pits that contained no water at all must have been freely draining, in the sense that they don't hold water because water's already passed through that strata. Now, my interpretation of that data is that the clay with flint strata is going to be somewhat variable in its composition, and that's the case across the catchment. Within the site, there was a small amount of perched water within some few number of trial pits, and that's quite commonly seen where you've got variable deposits, that you'll have some instances where water can penetrate, but then it sits at the base of your excavation and doesn't move any further because that underlying material is relatively impermeable. By contrast, the identification of no water within some of the trial pits doesn't necessarily indicate that the clay is free draining. It indicates that water hasn't got into that particular location and the clay is relatively dry. That means the overlying deposits within that excavation were relatively impermeable.
Can we just give the inspector a reference for this? Because this is the result of a test undertaken, which is included within the flood risk assessment and outline surface water drainage strategy, which is core document CD 1.29, and it's Appendix C. Are those the soakaway tests that you're referring to?
That's correct. And you can see from the soakaway test results that when they introduced water into those pits and they tested every single location, that over the time period of the test, they did not find any significant drainage of water, any loss of water during the testing sequence, which gives us pretty strong evidence that the shallow deposits, that shallow upper section of the clay with flint is pretty impermeable.
Then can we turn to your rebuttal, please, to pages 7 and 8, and also take out inquiry document 14, your technical note and errata corrections, and understand what all of that means in the event of escape of contaminated water from this site and its potential impact on the aquifer.
So in Mr. Carpenter's evidence, he suggested a water balance equation that is it is quite a simple equation. It is looking at water that has come out of a spring. It's based on the spring data. So water that comes out of the aquifer must go in somewhere. And he's looked at the area that might equate to that amount of water being identified. I think, and then stated that that must prove that the clay with flints is permeable, and because how else would the water get in there? Now, I think it's of note that when we look at the geological map showing the exposures of the green sand aquifer, that approximately in vicinity of the site, so it's a 2 kilometre square area that we've looked at, we calculate that 25% of that aquifer is exposed. If we accept that the green sand aquifer has a significantly higher conductivity, that means that it's significantly more permeable or able to transmit water, then that is where recharge would occur. And I quote in my rebuttal points raised by the British Geological Survey in their geological memoir for the same geological succession at Wellington, which is not very far from the site, that identifies that groundwater issues as springs along the flanks of the outcrop of the green sand strata, and provides groundwater supplies. But they also note that groundwater levels can fluctuate seasonally.
I'm sorry, you've lost me. Where have we gone to now in the
So
evidence?
I've gone to, in my rebuttal, section 2.220.
Thank you, I'm there.
And they also noted that the upper green sand outcrop could be covered with clay with flints, and that was predominantly, in their words, of low permeability and limits recharge to the underlying aquifers. So I think there's a strong body of evidence that the clay with flints at the site, based on site-specific testing, the geological memoirs, and given the thickness of that strata, that it's not going to permit water infiltration at significant rates.
And looking a bit more at that rate, you've provided a calculation in your rebuttal. Or actually, I think was it in your rebuttal, or was it your main proof of evidence that you've since corrected as part of ID 14? What are you doing with that calculation? And how does that help us understand the time that it would take for water from this site runoff to reach the aquifer below?
So quite frequently, when we are looking at existing contamination in soils and the potential for a leaching pathway to an aquifer that may underlie the site, we would want to understand how quickly a pathway may take, how quickly contaminants may migrate to that aquifer. So I presented an equation which is utilised within accepted Environment Agency models to show, for given relatively conservative precautionary values and assumptions of the clay permeability, and also the depth at which water could migrate. So I've limited that to where we've proven the clay with flints to be present through the investigation works at the site of 2.7 metres. We wanted to understand, well, how quickly would water take to get through that strata? And if water can get through that strata at a certain time period, then we know how quickly contaminants might get through within that water. So the reason for the technical memo erratum was there was a minor typo in the paragraph in my proof of evidence, where instead of saying 2.7 metres, it said 1 metre for migration. But I clarified that, for a depth of 1 metre thickness of that strata, we would expect water to migrate through that and reach that depth within about 4 to 6 months. In my view, that also helps demonstrate that low permeability.
And perhaps we'll get there in due course, but just in summary, what does that mean for a fire event leading to runoff on this site and its potential to migrate that contaminated water, to the extent that it is contaminated, to migrate to the aquifer below?
What that means is, in terms of the pathway for leaching directly down through that stratum to groundwater, effectively that pathway is incomplete. That impacts through leaching would not occur in significant time periods before suitable action can be taken to remove the source. Therefore, the main pathway of concern, and as proven through the design of the drainage system, is the potential for runoff.
So let's deal with that. And this is runoff, is it beyond the site?
Runoff beyond the site can only occur if the drainage system has failed, or if the drainage system has become overtopped, and if any responders to such a fire incident do nothing to prevent it. In terms of the evidence provided by Mr. Rigby, in his view, that the drainage system proposed for the site development contains a sufficient amount of water and would therefore break the contaminant pathway for surface water runoff outside of the site boundary.
So we explored scenarios where there is a greater volume of firewater put into the system than anticipated by the NFCC guidance, that there are severe storm circumstances occurring, and the situations that might lead to in terms of drainage capacity. But I guess for the purpose of understanding this pathway, as you say, we start from the position that the drainage system has failed, there's been overtopping. What's the pathway in that circumstance? And also, if we can think about, again, primarily in respect of the aquifer, and then we'll look at water sources which may or may not be downstream.
So in terms of the potential for overtopping of the drainage system, if we take that scenario as credible, then the water would most likely run down across the drainage system through existing drainage routes, which would be to the south of the site, and would follow through to Holbatch Brook. The strata in that direction is still clay with flint, which is why you have drainage ditches there. We would expect that surface water runoff to flow along that channel primarily, and then over a short time period pass through to the wider catchment.
You started that by saying if we take the overtopping as a credible scenario. What's your view about whether that is a credible scenario in this case?
With respect to the evidence provided by Mr. Rigby, the probability of a fire occurring at the same time as a severe storm, such that the entire containment of water on the site overtops and fails, plus that anyone attending that event would not do anything to prevent that, is incredibly remote and highly improbable.
you've mentioned twice now that no one would do anything about it. What are you thinking about there, please, Mr. Fellows? What would be done about it by those attending this event if there was a risk of water filling up the drainage system to the point of overtopping?
So, in the event of a fire, you would have the attendance of the fire service. And from evidence provided by Mr. Blunden and Mr. Reynolds in their experience of these fire events, the fire service do have due consideration to the environmental impacts of their activities. Obviously, primarily, they need to contain the fire through the strategy that's been agreed, the defensive firefighting strategy. But if they are using such a huge amount of water, or there's such a huge amount of water in the system that there's overtopping, it's reasonable for them to expect to try and manage that by trying to prevent that release of fire water.
And are you able to offer any evidence on, again, the situation where the drainage system has filled to the extent that it's overtopping? We're looking at a significant volume of water. What do you say about the level of contaminants within that volume of water?
So we need to take in mind that in the instance of a fire, there is a potential for contaminant to be emitted and potential for water that has been used to try and contain that fire to come into contact with those contaminants. And those contaminants would be essentially dissolved within that water body. Now, in a scenario where you've got a severe storm that has taken up the capacity of the water system, the water containment system, then you have an enormous amount of water on site. You have a fixed amount of contaminant, and you'd end up with a huge amount of dilution of that contaminant within the water. So at the point where you get overtopping, you have a significantly less significant source to deal with that is then entering the water supply because of the dilution that occurs with the amount of water in that system. There's another point to raise there about surface water runoff, is if you've got a storm affecting the site that has managed to fill up a significant amount of the containment system, that storm won't just be on the site, that storm would be occurring in the wider catchment. So you would also have a huge amount of water go in the surface water system and the catchment already. That would, yes, we'd like to prevent input of contaminants into surface water. But were that to occur, you would have a huge amount of dilution again within the wider system. I think to help exemplify that is, I mentioned before about the potential for PFAS source and the study by Quant et al. In my rebuttal, I looked at the concentrations that they identified in their study, being the extinguishing water from the vehicle battery fire, that had a stated amount of PFAS within it. I've then considered, well, if that's in a particular part of the system, zone 1, for example, and taken a conservative estimate, as we now know from the additional evidence provided by Mr. Rigby, what is a conservative estimate of the capacity of that system, that the dilution effect on that particular source concentration would be significant to the extent that what is emitted from the site in this unlikely scenario would be below the relevant drinking water guideline value for that substance.
I should also ask as well, that there was a similar point that you made in respect of leaching through the ground into the aquifer that we should have picked up on when we were looking at that pathway. But it was this in your proof of evidence, that if firewater, contaminated firewater enters into the ground, over the duration that it will need to filter through, there would be a breakdown in some of the composition of that contamination. Can I just understand a bit more on that from you, please, how that happens and the sort of length of time that we're looking at for those contaminants to reach the aquifer, if at all?
So we need to recognise that when contaminants enter soil, they're entering a system that contains, firstly, a lot of organic matter. So contaminants, depending on the contaminant, obviously it's all very dependent on the particular physical, chemical properties of the contaminant of concern. But organic contaminants will absorb to soil. There's also a number of other processes that would take place, such as potential degradation of those contaminants from microbial activity. And also we need to take into account potential for chemical changes of those contaminants within the water and the soil environment. Now, these particular functions are of key consideration when we look at actual risk to groundwater. We need to take into account the potential for what is called an umbrella term, attenuation of those contaminants in the unsaturated zone, when they're subject to leaching. But also this occurs in the groundwater itself. So when we have a contaminant reaching the groundwater, it would initially be diluted and dispersed as a plume. And we've seen instances of plumes in terms of air quality. The same thing happens in groundwater. You'll have a particular location being the source, and then as you move further away from that source location, the concentrations will reduce owing to these particular factors.
Thank you very much. Just again on surface water, can we go back to your plate 5 of your rebuttal? And perhaps, again, looking at the larger scale of that from Mr. Carpenter and understanding the potential pathways from surface water to people who might be using those for a variety of things. We've got, as you've identified on that plan, use unknown. We've got abstraction, water supply for livestock. All of those are listed in the key. So what's the pathway there, and is there a risk?
So the immediate pathway of concern would be overtopping, migration of water down Holbatch Brook, and potential for that water that could contain some levels of contaminants to be entering particular water supply features, and that's assuming people are taking water from the surface water. The evidence that we're presented and that I exemplify in plate 5 is that the private water supplies that are identified are spring sources. So these are naturally not connected to Holbatch Brook because there wouldn't be a spring source. These are tributaries that might lead into Holbatch Brook. And therefore, in the event of a release of water to the surface water, we wouldn't expect a particularly immediate risk to the residents in the area, because the contaminants wouldn't be coming out of the spring. They'd be going down the surface water course.
So the point is it's got to get into the aquifer first.
Yes, and that we've already demonstrated that leaching, direct leaching over any significant time period is not credible.
Thank you very much. Anything else to say on surface water or leaching before I'm going to move on to particular deposition?
No, I think that we need to take into account the drainage system that protects the site. The scenario that we're talking about in terms of impact to surface water is a result of a number and a sequence of improbable events. So, firstly, we need some form of failure of the drainage system. We need a storm event that would result in the drainage system being completely overfilled, and the fire event to occur at the same time, which we've already demonstrated is very improbable. Then we'd also need the source of concentrations within that water that's overtopping the system to be of concentrations that could pose a risk. That would be source concentrations not just above drinking water standard, but significantly above drinking water standard, such that when they get into the system of the watercourses, when they travel through what would be a catchment that is affected by additional ingress of water from the storm, that you would still have exceedance of drinking water standard at supply. And not only that, but you're also making an assumption that anyone attending the site, including the fire service, would do nothing about this. And I find all that sequence of the sequence of all of those stages of protection in response to a fire incident, plus the probability of these instances occurring together, to be incredibly remote.
There's another stage actually in the sequence as well, Mr. Fellows, that I want to ask you about, and we'll come on in a bit more detail when we look at remediation. You've described the sequence of events, which means that contamination is potentially in the aquifer. Then there's a stage that it has to be extracted and someone has to drink it. If there was a fire at the appeal site, how likely is it that those who rely on this aquifer for their private drinking supply wouldn't be told about the potential for contamination?
I think anyone living anyone living in proximity to the fire, to the site, would know about the fire event. And the fire service, when they attend these sites and they identify there's potential risk of pollution, they inform the Environment Agency, and they could also inform the local authority. The local authority have a duty to inform residents if there is a risk to private water supplies.
Thank you very much. We'll come on to look at that in a bit more detail in due course, because there's still two pathways that I want to look at. The next, please, is deposition and how significant particular deposition is as a pathway in this case.
So there's a lot of conversation yesterday with respect to air quality modelling, air quality risk assessment, about the potential for particulates to be emitted as part of a fire event, leading to a smoke plume, which would then lead to particulates being deposited due to largely wet deposition, so deposited in the vicinity of the site due to rainfall or due to actions of the fire service in terms of a spray or a mist, a vapour control. Now, it's of note in terms of Mr. Laxon's proof that he states that most deposition would occur over the first few hundred metres. He also states that, by 400 metres, in terms of studies undertaken on this subject, that within 400 metres, that the majority of the mass of particulates would have been deposited. We need to take into account the site geology, and in the close vicinity to the site, we're still over clay with flints. So the deposition of particulates does not pose an immediate risk to the aquifer, because again, we've ruled out the leaching pathway as being of concern. The other thing to note about deposition is, in context of a plume and in context of deposition rates, that the further distance you go from the initial fire event, that the flux of deposition of particulates reduces significantly. That is, the mass of particulates that are deposited over an area becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And these are all given in the region of milligrams per metre squared particulates. Now, these milligrams per metre squared particulates then don't in and of themselves pose a risk. They wouldn't necessarily affect soil quality. They are small fragments of partially combusted materials, but it's the contaminants that absorb to those particulates that are of interest to us in terms of contamination risk assessment. And if you take together the declining deposition ratio of deposition of particulates, and you take together the potential low source concentrations within particulates and within the fire emission overall, that in my opinion, you would not have significant concentrations of contaminant that are deposited on soils in vicinity of the site that would materially alter the soil chemistry and materially alter the chemical, the mass of contaminant within that soil. On that basis, I don't consider that particulates are of specific concern to soil quality. And when I say soil quality, arising from soil quality is obviously the relevant pathways we've discussed, because the soil then becomes the residual source of contaminants.
So we've got two potential things there: crops and animals that might be either growing or taking nutrition from the soil. What do you anticipate the effect from a battery fire on this site being on those as receptors, ultimately then to be consumed by humans?
Given the concentrations estimated of particulates, the effect on soil quality and the contaminant concentrations within soil would be minimal, and therefore the effect on uptake of contaminants into plant root systems and into pastoral animals that are then grazing on those plants would also be significantly minimal and not discernible from background concentrations, in my view.
There's a point that was made by Mr. Laxon about copper, iron and aluminium as potential contaminants from a battery fire. And I think you've addressed those in your evidence as to whether they are contaminants of concern. What do you say about that?
So iron and aluminium do not have health-based standards for soil. Not contaminants that we routinely test for, and they're not considered to be significantly toxic to pose a risk in the soil environment. Copper is a contaminant that we test for, but it's of note that, for example, acceptable concentrations of copper within a residential garden is in the thousands of milligram per kilogram range. So far in excess of any additional deposition you might expect from a fire source. And secondly, we can look at mapping produced by the BGS on what they call normal background concentrations. And in vicinity of this site, copper is identified in normal background concentrations. So there is an element of baseline levels of copper that, in my view, you would not have a discernible increase in copper concentration from a fire incident.
Next is PFAS pathways and how we currently assess for PFAS contamination. Are you able to provide your evidence on that, please, Mr. Fellows?
So we need to keep PFAS in context. The PFAS are a relatively, although PFAS have been produced for decades in products, they're a relatively new contaminant requiring assessment. The toxic effects of PFAS were not fully understood until very recently. And as noted by Mr. Reynolds and in Environment Agency literature, PFAS are routinely present in all sorts of products that we utilise in our daily lives. So they're present in furnishings, in clothing, cookware, present in cars, and numerous other household products. And PFAS comprise an enormous group of substances, tens of thousands of substances. And the ongoing emissions of PFAS to the wider environment are well documented. So we know that the key sources of PFAS to the environment include sewage treatment works, industrial trade effluent, landfills, airports and fire training sites, and through spreading of biosolids on agricultural fields. And that is because the systems that we have in place to take PFAS out of waste products, they're not in place. It's very difficult for water companies and for those dealing with waste materials to remove PFAS because of their persistence. We also have documented exposure from PFAS to human health from food bought at supermarkets and from bottled water. So they're a substance that we need to take into account that are a global problem and a national problem. And in February, DEFRA published their strategy on dealing with PFAS. That strategy recognised a number of key things. That there's uncertainty on the toxicology of PFAS. There's uncertainty on potential exposure routes of PFAS to the wider population. And they've proposed a sequence of research areas that they are now looking at to inform policy. So with respect to PFAS, there is a reasonable expectation that PFAS is present in surface waters and in groundwaters and in soil as background concentrations. And that's notwithstanding the potential PFAS exposure that occurs in the home. Now, in my evidence, I reference studies from the British Geological Survey, which is CD 12.6. Now, I mentioned before about normal background concentrations, and for example, with copper. How those are derived is the BGS have undertaken a series of extensive soil sampling programs across the country and then mapped the concentrations of those contaminants. With respect to PFAS, obviously when those initial studies were undertaken, PFAS wasn't a contaminant of concern in public awareness. But they have since looked at the samples, some of the samples that they took as part of that study, and they've resampled those specific locations and analysed those samples for presence of PFAS and assessed that whether there's any change in PFAS concentration between the two sample datasets. And they identified that on average, there was a potential background concentration of PFAS in soils of around 3 micrograms per kilogram. And those samples were not from locations of known PFAS sources. So we need to be aware that our exposure to PFAS is not strictly just related to best fires. We have a wider level of exposure to PFAS from our general environment, and that is still an area that's subject to research and further policy from government.
Thank you very much for that. I want to move then, please, to core document 12.9, which is the Syria guidance on contaminated land risk assessment. And you've referred to this in your evidence. It's an extract of 4 pages. And we've spoken about the sources, pathways, and receptors, but how does one then decide, understanding those features, if further action is required to prevent contamination or to design out that risk and how that should be done? Does this guidance help us?
Yeah, so I'll refer you to that Syria document. I've provided extracts. It is a framework and a process for coming to consistent decision-making on contamination risk. And it's endorsed by the Environment Agency with respect to it essentially lifted, taken out and used in Environment Agency guidance that they prepared with the NHBC for housing developments. So it's very well established, and it does provide a consistent framework within which we can work and liaise with regulators on. What that guidance does, if I just take you through, if you got the printout, if I just take you briefly through it. So firstly, we have the overarching framework, which is we identify a hazard, we assess that hazard. So for example, in the scenario on this site, the hazard is a fire. The hazard is that source of contamination. The hazard assessment is then, well, what is the potential concentration of that contaminant? What are the particular contaminants of concern? But then we need to look at risk estimation, where we're talking about, well, what are the pathways? How does that particular hazard cause an effect? And then we look at risk evaluation, which is one of the more important aspects. We're looking at, okay, we've got a hazard, we could have an effect. How significant is it? And do we need to do anything about it? So in terms of the way I approach contamination risk assessment, and particularly we're at that desk study stage in terms of a planning submission, is that I follow this guidance quite strictly. So if we move over to page table 6.3 on the other page. So it's page 80 in the guidance on my second page on my printout. The classification of consequence. So we discussed the RMA report, and that was very clear with regard to how they classified risk. And in the application of the Syria guidance, we have very similar definitions in order so that we understand what is a severe consequence event, what is a medium consequence event, and so on. So it's quite clear that when we look at severe, we are looking at short-term acute risks to human health, likely to result in significant harm. Significant harm has a separate interpretation under Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act. But this is really where there is a credible risk to health. So to give an example, this could be a major spillage of pollutants. It could be, for example, give an example, you've got a house with a heating oil tank. The heating oil tank leaks, results in loss of heating oils to the ground, which then permeate drinking water supply to that house in terms of the pipe work running through the house, and therefore there's noticeable evidence of contaminants within that drinking water supply. That would be significant harm because there's clear and demonstrable evidence of a risk to health, an immediate risk to health. Now, and it's short-term and acute. If someone was to drink that water, then clearly they'd be going to hospital for hydrocarbon poisoning. The next stage is you can look at multiple classifications, multiple potential eventualities. So the next one is a medium consequence. Now, this is defined as chronic damage to health through pollution of sensitive water resources. And that could be much lower concentrations of contaminants within groundwater or within the water environment that over a long time period could lead to health complications. So it's not an acute risk in terms of you have one glass of this stuff and you're in hospital. It's a chronic exposure where your health could be affected after a significant period of time. And then we have mild consequences. And this is really where we're looking at property, structures, potential impacts to groundwater, where the groundwater is not used for supply. And those are easily rectified through some expenditure to resolve.
I'm just going to ask you, Mr. Fellows, to just highlight the parts of this guidance most relevant to your assessment of the site. I've got one eye on the clock, and we're 12 minutes to 12. I know it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, but I think we probably need to speed this up just to draw out the main points from this guidance that you want the inspector to take away, and what the interaction probably is between classification of consequence and classification of probability.
Absolutely. Apologies for time. So when we're looking at this particular theoretical event on site, I've already explained the circumstances in which a pollution event might occur, and those are quite extreme. I've explained how we have a particular source of contaminants which, under the scenario in which a pollution event might occur, would be very dilute. And therefore, in my view, we can rule out severe classification consequence from this possible fire event. Therefore, we are looking at a medium consequence event whereby there could be a loss of contaminants to the wider water environment, surface water, in which people could have contact. Now, that is quite a fixed classification. There's very strict definitions on what we mean by the consequence of a pollution event. And then we look at probability. And a lot of the risk assessment and risk evaluation is around the probability of that event. So you can see the definitions of probability, table 6.4, that we look at high likelihood, a likelihood, low likelihood, and unlikely, with clear definitions of what those mean. And in context of this particular site and the potential for a risk to be realised, we've already identified that it's exceedingly unlikely that the drainage system would be overtopped to the extent that you have a pollution incident. Therefore, we are readily and possibly beyond the unlikely scenario given in the classification of the Syria guidance. And therefore, we can move through to page 82 of that guidance, where we bring the classification of consequence. So we've identified a potential medium consequence to water resources, and we look at the probability, and using the risk matrix, which is an established method of qualitative risk assessment, we then identify that that particular linkage is of low risk. And that's the same conclusion that there's a classification of that low risk. And that is basically, it's possible that harm could occur, but if realised, at worst, that would be mild. And a mild consequence to that is something that's readily resolved and not of significant concern. So we demonstrate that overall, the water containment system, the drainage strategy, and the design of the site specifically acts to prevent pollution. In the exceedingly extreme scenario presented, where a fire occurs during a severe storm event such that that system cannot cope, and that people don't do anything about it, we would still have a low and possibly a very low risk dependent on the concentrations emitted in that scenario.
Just to be clear, for a medium classification of consequence, is there any lower category that this could fall into?
Not as per this guidance, no.
And to what extent is the appellant's case on that supported by the local authority recorded in both the Statement of Common Ground and the opening statement to the inquiry?
So one of the reasons I bring the Syria risk ranking in is because of the terminology used. There's consistency in how land contamination professionals assess risk and the phraseology that we use. So the LPA opening statement identified the comments of their independent expert on land contamination risk. And just to re-emphasize what they said, they said the site was carefully designed to capture firefighting water runoff. They said that significantly reduced risks posed to the site, and the likelihood of drinking waters being contaminated was unlikely. A severity of contamination in such event would be low and short-lived and would not pose lasting impacts. And that assessment is consistent with the assessment I have made.
Thank you very much. And what confidence can the inspector have that the local planning authority have made a proper assessment in this matter of those issues?
I believe the inspector can derive a large amount of confidence on the basis that you've got two independent practitioners in this area using the same Environment Agency approved framework of assessment, looking at the same information about the site condition and its development, the sensitivity of the environment, the development and the mitigations afforded in that development, and come to the same conclusion.
Final question then is on the assumption that everything's gone wrong, that there has been a fire incident at site. there has been a contaminants released into the environment. What happens next in your experience? How is that dealt with?
So firstly, you know, if the site were to be approved, then there's a condition with respect to the emergency response plan. So you would expect attendees at the site to be aware of and following that emergency response plan, which would include measures to prevent pollution. As we've seen through similar instances such as at Tilbury, that when the fire service attend a site and there's a potential for a pollution issue, they will contact the Environment Agency and report it as a pollution incident. The Environment Agency have their own process of assessing and classifying that pollution incident in order that they can understand what level of response they need to provide to the team on site, but also to the operator in terms of a regulatory enforcement position. So they're involved in a very early stage, and that includes technical officers with experience of dealing with pollution matters. There's also legal duties on the local authority to identify risks to private water supplies and to inform residents if there is a concern. They also provide sampling and testing services if assurance is required over the quality of private water supplies. And of course, because there's a potential risk to human health, then the environmental health team would be of interest in regulating the activities of the operator to deal with the incident accordingly. In my experience dealing with pollution incident response, I used to work for a remediation contractor who deals with oil spill pollution, particularly heating oil. So in a similar scenario, rural areas where you have a loss of potentially thousands of litres of heating oil to the ground, with potential to impact the surface waters and groundwater. In those instances, there is a number of contractors, and Josh, in his evidence, mentioned a few. In my own case, the company I used to work for actually have an office in Honiton. And they work very closely with the site operator to attend site as soon as it's practicable. Obviously, the site needs to be made safe in terms of fire risk, and to remove contamination as quickly as possible so that there isn't an ongoing potential source. That's consistent with the LCRM guidance, which I mentioned at the very start, which has specific requirements to manage new pollution incidents. So whereas with historical contamination, we can look at it, we can assess it, we can sit back and say, okay, well, let's deal with this in a certain way. With new pollution, we need to act a lot more quickly. And therefore, the push from the Environment Agency is to get to site, remediate sources, and mitigate potential harms that may occur from that pollution. In terms of the wider response, once you've removed the source, once the initial, let's say, for example, water still contained in the drainage system that could be contaminated, or material at the surface of the site, or water runoff that might have occurred to a field adjacent, that can be immediately removed. It can also be tested. Samples can be taken of the water supply, samples can be taken of the soil, and we can get a very rapid look at what the issues are following such an incident, and therefore very quickly identify what else needs to be undertaken in line with the Environment Agency guidance. Therefore, the residual risks are managed, are subject to the collection of appropriate data, and then that's regulated by the relevant authorities, Environment Agency, etc., to ensure that the remediation of the site is appropriate and the site is returned to its original condition as soon as practicable.
Thank you very much. Now, I said that was the last question, but you did offer up another document that you wanted to discuss as part of the core documents for your examination in chief, and that was core document 18.2, which is the fire services response dated the 29th of February 2024, CD 18.2. If I can just offer you the opportunity to say what you wanted to say about that consultation response. If you just hold on, yeah.
The reason I reference this particular document is it's important to understand that consultation has taken place with the fire service with regard to the proposed development and the mitigation measures incorporated within that development to prevent pollution. And what I wanted to point out was in page 3 of the letter that they provide, they discuss the need for an emergency response plan. They discuss the importance of that. And they also say, in summary, it would appear the applicant has proposed an approach that reduces risk to as low as reasonably possible. And I think it's important that that we recognise that the fire service have been involved, are aware of the issues, and therefore will be well prepared to deal with pollution events were a fire to occur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fellows. Is there anything else that you want to say at this stage?
No, I think I could have gone for longer, but I do appreciate the clock is ticking. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a break now. Mr. Parkinson, what did you estimate for your cross-examination?
I can't remember, but I think an hour. I mean, obviously, as he's fully entitled to do, Mr. Fellows has sort of ranged over all of the evidence. I'm not going to pick up every single point and just focus on what he adds to the party. So I would say about an hour. But if it's possible to have the full 15-minute break, just to clear heads before we get into it again, that would be appreciated.
I was going to suggest that we take 20 minutes because we've been sat for 2 hours now. Is everyone happy with 20 minutes? Okay, on that basis then we are adjourned until 22 minutes past. Thank you. Okay, we are resumed. Mr. Parkinson, are you ready for cross-examination?
Thank you, Madam. Yes, I am. Good afternoon, Mr. Fellows. So in terms of documents, you'll be relieved maybe to hear that there's only two that we need to go to. I think the first is the Controlled Waters Assessment, which is CD 1.26. And then the second is some EA advice on groundwater, which is CD 12.2. You got all of that? Great, thank you. So if we just start off with some questions about the scope of your evidence. And you, like I think all of the appellant's witnesses, have assumed that the worst case scenario here is a fire limited to 1 unit on the best site. Is that correct?
Yes, based on the evidence provided by people with expertise in that area.
Yeah, and in terms of your reliance on other people's evidence, you rely on Mr. Blunden's evidence on fire risk, Mr. Rigby's evidence on the adequacy of the drainage system, and Mr. Lester's evidence on airborne emissions and deposition. Is that correct?
Of course, because those aren't my areas of expertise.
Yeah, so whilst you sort of bring it together, and we heard that this morning, you're ultimately reliant on those inputs. So what I'm not going to do is challenge you on everything that you've said, much of which, as you know, the Rule 6 party disagrees with, and instead focus on the points where you bring additional evidence to the inquiry. And if we just take one example of that, you said on a number of occasions that it's incredibly unlikely that the drainage system will overtop. And of course, that's a matter that falls squarely within the evidence of Mr. Rigby that we heard last week, isn't it?
Yes, because he has expertise in drainage.
Yep, so in terms of your evidence, and if we just sort of place this in context, I don't think any of this will be controversial, but we agree that the Upper Green Sand Formation is designated as a principal aquifer, don't we?
That's in the Statement of Common Ground, yes.
And what that means is it's accepted that that is a highly sensitive receptor.
It is a sensitive receptor, yes.
Yeah, highly sensitive receptor. The aquifer is a highly sensitive receptor. Or are you just saying high? So are you just saying sensitive?
Well, no, I would say that it is a sensitive receptor. The site is not over a source protection zone, so I would not say it's highly sensitive.
Okay, well, we're going to come on to source protection zone mapping, but just to be clear, are you saying the only reason why you're quibbling with highly is the fact that the site isn't shown on the mapping as being within a source protection zone? Is that correct?
I would say a site that is in a source protection zone is highly sensitive.
In terms of surface water, though, we are definitely agreed that the surface water environment here can be classed as having high sensitivity.
The surface water status is under WFD is good, so yeah, surface water is a sensitive receptor.
Yeah, and the site is hydraulically linked to the River Axe, SAC and Triple SI, and you class, or it was classed in the controlled waters assessment, that they are also both highly sensitive receptors. Is that right?
Yes, as designated sites, they are sensitive receptors.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can go to the reference if we need to, but the controlled water assessment assessed them both as being of high sensitivity.
That's fair enough, yeah.
I just want to see where all of this gets us on your own evidence. Can you turn to paragraph 3.6.13? Yeah, sorry, it's 3.6.13 in Mr. Fellow's proof.
Yep.
And you touched on this briefly at the end of your evidence in chief. I think it's worth just coming back to it. You say here, a medium consequence event comprising a significant effect on water quality and requirement to notify abstractors could be foreseeable and remains a precautionary assumption. And that's your evidence, isn't it? That there is a foreseeable event that could occur here which would have a significant effect on water quality and a requirement to notify abstractors.
It would be reasonable if a fire occurred at a site that the people using private water supplies in the area were notified, yes.
Yeah, but it's not just that, comprising a significant effect on water quality. So there's a requirement to notify, but the requirement to notify is because it's accepted that an event is foreseeable, that an event occurs here which has a significant effect on water quality.
Yeah, a foreseeable fire event doesn't make the fire event likely. There is a potential for an effect on water quality. The significance would be determined once the scale of the event is known and waters can be sampled.
Yeah, we've got to look at both, as you've explained, probability or possibility, and then also the consequence. But on the consequence side, if we go to your Appendix B in your proof, page 23, the foreseeable consequence, putting aside probability, the foreseeable consequence is we can see, if we look under the bullet point that says medium, chronic damage to human health, pollution of sensitive water resources, significant change in an ecosystem or organism forming part of that ecosystem. And the foreseeable consequence here falls within that descriptor, doesn't it?
Yes, what's stated there is consistent with the Syria guidance.
Thank you. And if we just see what the difference is between that and something that's recognised to be a severe consequence. I mean, some people might say that is severe, but we'll follow the guidance anyway. If we go to your paragraph 3.6.3 in your proof, and you say there, the effect of pollution on the groundwater that results in the closure of an abstraction would be considered a severe consequence. So you're saying that there would be a requirement to notify because of the potential of significant harm, i.e. the pollution of a sensitive water resource, but we haven't got to the point where there's a closure of an abstraction. Is that the distinction that's drawn between medium and severe?
So the closure of an abstraction would clearly be a severe consequence for the person who abstracts that water.
Yeah, but let's just sort of move away from matrices and the guidance stuff and get into the real world. If somebody is told, if they are notified that their private water supply has a risk of contamination and pollution, the consequence will be that they will stop using it. Is that a fair assumption?
Not necessarily. The consequence would be that they would test it.
The consequence is they'll test it, but they will not be able to use it until it's been tested, and if there is contamination, until that contamination's been removed. So
Sorry, Mr. Parkinson, I'll get you to ask the question again. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but please, members of the public gallery, please control your reactions to points that are said. It's important that Mr. Fellows and Mr. Parkinson are able to do the cross-examination fairly. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Until the private water supply has been tested and any contaminants which are foreseeable are removed, it becomes unusable, doesn't it? Effectively becomes closed.
Only if there are contaminants present as a result of the fire that are above drinking water standards.
Yeah, and that's accepted to be a foreseeable consequence, pollution of sensitive water resources. So what I'm saying here is actually the distinction between a medium and a severe consequence is sort of dancing on the head of a pin, because as soon as somebody is notified, until we've reached the point of determining that there's either no contamination or the contamination is removed, that abstraction is effectively closed, isn't it, which is classed as a severe event.
That's a reasonable precautionary step taken when there is a concern about public health.
Yeah, precisely. Now, I'll just pick up on a couple of points you made in your evidence in chief, and there's a lot of reference to the council's position. Have you seen any report or document or written explanation beyond what's in the statement of common ground to explain why the council's expert reached the view that he did?
No, I've not seen that correspondence.
Thank you. So the extent of our understanding of the council's position is what we see in the statement of common ground, the conclusions without the explanation or the reasoning that sits behind it.
Well, I think the statement provides a reasonable justification.
If, having heard your evidence and the evidence of all the other appellant witnesses, the inspector takes the view that she disagrees with your evidence, the fact that there is a statement of common ground from the council that records effectively the same view as you, but not supported by 20, 30 pages of written evidence, is something that would probably, in your opinion, should be given limited weight. Is that correct?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
The question is, we've got your evidence and the council's evidence, and as you've said, you've reached the same conclusion, yeah?
It appears to be the case, yes.
Your evidence is supported by 20, 30 pages of written evidence, isn't it?
And the risk assessment that was submitted with the application, yes.
If, having heard that evidence, heard Mr. Carpenter's response and heard it being tested, the inspector disagrees with it, limited weight can be given to the position of the council set out in the statement of common ground. That follows as a matter of common sense, doesn't it?
Well, that would be up to the inspector, not up to me.
I'm asking your view.
I'm not qualified to comment on the views of the inspector.
You took us to, just finally on your evidence in chief and things that came out of that, you took us to a response from the DSFRS at CD 8.12. Are you aware that that's for a different site? It's not for this site?
No.
I mean, if we just yeah. And do you know what happened to that site on appeal, the Pound Farm site, east of Wareham Road?
I believe Pound Farm was rejected on appeal.
Thank you. Okay. So if we then move on to the question of whether there's a pathway to groundwater, and can you take up Mr. Carpenter's proof of evidence? And if you could go to his figures or his drawings at the back, the ones that you went to in your evidence in chief.
Is that figure 2, Mr Parkinson?
It's drawing 1, actually. It's the one with the springs and the private water supplies marked on it. We've been to this several times now. We can see what Mr Carpenter's done, and it marks on various springs, private water supplies, boreholes, etc. There's no dispute as to the accuracy of what's shown on this plan, is there, in terms of the location of the springs that the Rule 6 party has been able to identify?
I can't dispute the accuracy of the plan, but there is a wider context in consideration of the sanctity of the aquifer and the sanctity of the water environment, that there are springs and there are private water supplies.
Yeah, but in terms of the locations here and where they are and what they're for, you don't call any evidence to dispute what's shown on this drawing, do you?
No.
Okay. Now, if we just think about pathways to the groundwater, okay, there are 2 potential pathways, aren't there? And they are different. There's the sort of on-site pathway, laterally down, which I think you called leaching, which is concerned with water that passes through the liner and then through the clay with flints and then gets to the groundwater that way. That's one pathway, is that correct?
To clarify, leaching is the percolation of water through unsaturated strata. So that can occur on-site and off-site.
Okay, fine. There's that pathway, but in terms of the on-site, the liner is only on-site, isn't it? So where you make references to the liner and the liner offering a layer of protection, we're talking there about an on-site pathway vertically down, aren't we?
Yes, because the liner helps to contain the water on-site.
And then there's also a sort of overtopping pathway, which I know isn't a technical term, but just so that we all know what we're talking about here, which is where water overtops the drainage system and moves off-site through that route. Okay, and that's a separate and different pathway, isn't it?
It's a consequence of leaching not being a significant pathway yet.
I'm not going to pick up the suggestion that leaching isn't a significant pathway. I want to focus on that overtopping pathway. Now, as we've discussed, the adequacy of the drainage system is a matter for Mr. Rigby. You said on a number of occasions, though, that this pathway relies on there being a fire event and a storm event at the same time. Do you remember saying that?
Well, there needs to be a source of contamination, so there must be a fire event. And the system, for it to be full of water and therefore to reach capacity, there needs to be a storm event.
Could I have your answer again, please, Mr Fellows? I couldn't hear that.
Apologies. For a source of contamination to be present, there needs to be a fire. For the overtopping pathway to be present, then the drainage system needs to have met capacity through additional water being present.
Through additional water, but that additional water doesn't necessarily need to be stormwater. It could be a combination of fire water, so water that the fire service put on the site, and potentially also a storm at the same time. But it's no part of Mr. Carpenter's evidence to say that you need to have a storm at the same time as a fire in order for the drainage system to overtop. Did you understand that?
I believe Mr. Rigby's already dealt with that issue.
Now, we agree that when the drainage system, or if the drainage system overtops, the water is likely to discharge to the brook, the watercourse to the southeast of the site, correct?
It would be expected to follow the route of the drainage system and the topography of the area, yeah.
And then if we take up your rebuttal, your plate 5. We can see where that watercourse goes, and we can see that it flows, and then it flows over the green that we see on this plan, and that's the exposed green sand, isn't it?
Yes.
And that's about, I think Mr. Carpenter estimates, there's about 100 to 200 metres of exposed green sand there. And the water will reach that area of exposed green sand quickly, won't it?
Potentially, yeah.
And you accept, don't you, that the green sand, water recharges to the aquifer through the green sand, through, amongst other things, leakage from surface water flow.
It's possible, but it's not proven to be the case.
Let's just look at your paragraph 2.2.18. Sorry, 2.2.13. 13.
Are we still in the rebuttal?
We are still in the rebuttal, yes. Thank you, madam. And you say there, in the vicinity of the site, the outcrop of the upper green sand formation is approximately 25% of the total area of the formation and is therefore likely to contribute significantly to aquifer recharge from direct rainwater infiltration and leakage from surface water courses. So you're identifying there infiltration from surface water courses as they pass over the exposed green sand, aren't you?
There may be a limited amount of leakage from surface water courses. However, the maps don't indicate that there are any sinks for those surface water courses into the underlying geology. So therefore, the surface water flow would be the predominant pathway.
Yeah, but all the calculations that you've put in and the calculations you put in yesterday, that's all about infiltration and how fast water moves through clay. At this point, we've moved beyond the clay with flints, haven't we? And we're now dealing with a situation where we have water flowing over the exposed green sand, yes?
Yep.
And you accept that as water flows over the exposed green sand, it can infiltrate down into the groundwater.
It's possible.
It's possible, and in terms of something we'll come back to at the end, evidential gaps, we have an evidential gap there. I mean, you're saying now that I think it will be slow or a small amount, but we simply don't know, do we? Mr. Carpenter says that there'll be a significant amount of infiltration there. What we can all agree is that infiltration is possible as the brook flows over the exposed green sand.
Mr. Carpenter said that the recharge to the aquifer and the change in groundwater level associated with the aquifer was entirely from leaching through the clay with flints.
No, he didn't, and we'll come back to this, okay? But forget about what you think Mr. Carpenter said, okay? We agree that water can infiltrate into the groundwater through the exposed green sand as the surface water flows past over it, don't we?
Yes, but as I said, it's reasonable to expect, given that surface water remains present, that that the majority of water flow would be as surface water.
And once in the aquifer, and we have, we're in a scenario here where we've got contaminated fire water, we have a proportion, and there's a difference in professional judgment and an evidential gap about how much goes into the groundwater, but some goes in. Once it goes in, it moves with the groundwater flow, doesn't it?
So are you talking about leakage from the surface water, or are you talking about?
I'm talking about what we're talking about here, which water which has got into the brook is flowing over the exposed green sand, it then infiltrates into the aquifer. At that point, it's moving with the groundwater flow, isn't it?
So what would happen is water would go over the green sand. Possible, but again, as you say, not proven, that an amount of that water could leak to the aquifer, and it would be subject to leaching through that green sand aquifer until it reaches groundwater,
Yeah. So we got a pathway here to the groundwater, and the springs in this vicinity, if we look at Mr. Carpenter's figure 1, the springs that we see there in yellow, green, and orange, they're all fed by the aquifer, aren't they?
Yes.
So contaminated water which has got into the groundwater will emerge through these springs, won't it?
Water emerges through the springs. Obviously, the level of contamination emanating from the site, then entering the watercourse, then infiltrating down through the unsaturated green sand aquifer, which is shown on Mr. Carpenter's geological cross-section, and then entering groundwater and then emanating as a spring is uncertain.
Well, I'm not sure it is that uncertain. If there is contaminants in the firewater, okay, and I know you dispute that, that's a matter for largely for last week. If there is contamination in the firewater and it gets into the groundwater at this point, it will then emerge from the groundwater through springs, won't it? That's how it gets back to the surface.
Water would emerge. As I explained, there's numerous potential factors to be taken into account of whether contaminants would emerge in the same timescales.
Yeah, but let's just do this in stages. If I'll add in that additional caveat if you want, but if firewater is contaminated, and if it remains contaminated, when it emerges, it will emerge through these springs, won't it, and private water supplies.
It's not clear that that's the case, because you are suggesting that the level of contamination that would emerge from a spring would be equivalent to the level of contamination that might emanate from the site, and that's not the case.
I'm actually not even trying to suggest that. I'm just trying to establish a basic concept that I think we all know and agree, that if water infiltrates to the groundwater, it then emerges through springs. Can we agree that at least?
Yes.
So what goes down, and I know that there's a dispute about what goes down and whether it's contaminated and how contaminated it is, then comes up, and it comes up through these springs, doesn't it?
That's possible, depending on the particular groundwater flow direction.
Yeah, which leads me on to my next question. There's been no attempt, so we're agreed that water can get into the water or contaminated firewater, whatever side of the debate you're on, can get into the groundwater in this location. There's been no attempt to consider groundwater flow directions, velocities, or travel times, has there?
To be clear, if we follow the...
Sorry, to repeat the question again. There's been no attempt to identify or model groundwater flows, velocities or travel times, has there?
No, there has been no attempt, but that's because the groundwater conditions under the site are easily interpreted, sites on the top of a catchment. And also, if we follow the LCRM process, we must consider the effort to assess risk needs to be proportional to that level of risk.
Yeah, we're going to come on to that at the end, and whether there has been a proportionate assessment here. But we agree that what goes down must come back up. And these springs, as well as being private water supplies, they also then feed the watercourses, don't they? So what comes out then enters back into the overland flow and carries on down the watershed, doesn't it?
What is present as overland flow would continue down the stream.
No, that wasn't my question. My question was, what comes out of the springs, and what's coming out of the springs is coming from the groundwater, yes?
Yes.
So what comes out of the springs, and there's a dispute about whether what comes out is contaminated or not, but what comes out then feeds the watercourses and carries on down the watershed, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And let's just think about where we're at here. You accept, or at least the Controlled Waters Assessment accepts, that, well, let's get that up actually, rather than me summarising it. So it's CD 1.26. And then it's pages 17. Page 17 is where it starts. So if we look at, this is the section dealing with contamination of surface water drainage system in the event of fire impacting water resources and controlled water environments. So that's what we're considering here. And if we go down to paragraph 5.32, you say there, with no measures in place, the effect magnitude of contamination from fire water is considered to be medium on surface water. The effect significance of a contamination event as a result of a fire occurring prior to mitigation is considered to be moderate to major adverse on WFD catchments, the river acts, and water resources. So that's what we're looking at here, moderate to major adverse. But it goes on to say, given the limited pathway as a result of the underlying unproductive superficial deposits, is that a reference there to clay with flints?
That would be a reasonable conclusion, yeah.
So because of the clay with flints, the effect magnitude from firewater is considered to be negligible on groundwater, and therefore there's a negligible effect significance on groundwater. Now, we've agreed that there is a potential pathway to the groundwater that avoids water infiltrating through clay with flints, haven't we?
Yes, but this is outside of the drainage system. So the RMA report goes on to incorporate mitigation afforded by the drainage system.
Yeah, it looks at the mitigation afforded by the drainage system. But in terms of how much confidence we have to have in the mitigation provided by the drainage system, that mitigation is taking us down from a major adverse effect to a negligible effect. So we would have to have a high degree of confidence in that drainage system, wouldn't we, in order to be satisfied that the effects here are acceptable?
Yes, and that's a reasonable assumption to make when you've got a drainage design.
Well, as I said, I want to explore any of the matters that you deal with, whether the drainage system does provide that degree of confidence is a matter on which we've already heard evidence. Okay, if we then move on to, actually, just wait 1 second. Madam, I don't know, I think my hour might have been a bit optimistic. I don't know what you want to do about lunch. I mean, now is a break, but I'm at the same time probably about a quarter of the way through, a third of the way through, so I don't know what's best.
Okay, in that case, I think I know what's best, and I think that's that we have a lunch break. Just before we do break, can I remind you, Mr. Fellows, when we come back, try to keep speaking into your microphone, because sometimes I am finding it hard to catch every word that you say. Okay, so we are 1 o'clock. We'll take a break until 2 o'clock. Is there any housekeeping we need to attend to over the lunch break? Okay, in that case, we are adjourned. Mr. Fellows, you understand your position, don't you?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Okay.